Hello and welcome to today's webinar, the Responsible Down Standard Revision 3.0. Today's presentation will be recorded and sent out to all registered participants and will also be posted on Textile Exchange's Hub Resource Library. We will have a Q&A portion at the end of the presentation. You can type your questions into the question box on the webinar doc, and any unanswered questions will be answered afterwards via email. Now on to Ashley Gill, Senior Manager of Industry Integrity at Textile Exchange.
Thank you very much, Rita. Welcome to today's webinar. Thank you all so much for registering, for joining us today. What I'm going to be doing is walking you through the updated standard. I'll start with a little bit of context, and then I will dive into what's new in the standard and what it means for you. But before I do that, I want to give you just a little bit of context for Textile Exchange. If you're not familiar with Textile Exchange, we are the owners of the Responsible Down Standard, and this type of work is just one of the ways that Textile Exchange seeks to have an impact on the industry. Our vision is a global textile industry that protects and restores the environment and enhances lives. And then if you look at our mission, we are aiming to inspire and equip people to accelerate sustainable practices in the textile value chain. And this really is the heart of the organization. We really want, we believe that people are the ones that can really affect change. And so we want to make sure that that you as a decision maker in the industry have everything you need to push sustainability forward. One of the key ways that we do that is through standards. And so I'll talk a little bit about Textile Exchange's approach to sustainability standards in a second. Just a quick run through again for the agenda for today. I'm going to walk you through how Textile Exchange approaches standards. We will look at the role of the Responsible Down Standard and how it fits in to the work of Textile Exchange and into the industry. And then I will introduce you to the new RDS 3.0. We'll look at some of the changes that are in the new version, as well as what's coming up in the next year. We're also going to look at what this means for you. So I have some next steps for different parts of the supply chain, and then we'll also have some time for question and answer. And I did mention to Rita that I'm happy to be interrupted for a clarifying question, but that other questions will hold them all to the end. So if you do have anything, you see anything, or you hear anything that you don't understand or want a clarification point, feel free to send that in and we'll address it as we go. Textile Exchange standards, creating real and meaningful change. We absolutely believe that a big part of moving towards greater sustainability is ensuring that the steps that companies are taking actually result in real and meaningful change. Essentially, that we're not just talking about change, or we're not just talking about what we're doing, but that things on the ground are actually changing and moving forward. Textile Exchange owns 6 standards currently. We started off with, as some of you may know, Textile Exchange was previously Organic Exchange. We started off with owning what was then known as the OE 100 and OE blended standards, and those have become now the Organic Content Standard, which verifies organically grown content, tracks it through the supply chain, and provides labeling and communication options for consumers. What followed was the Global Recycled Standard, and when we took ownership of that standard over, we broke it up into 2 different standards that both verify recycled content, track it through the supply chain, provide labeling and communications options, and the Global Recycled Standard includes additional social and environmental requirements at the facility level and chemical processing restrictions for the products that are certified. And all of our standards use the same foundation of chain of custody, which is what we call the content claims standard. And this is that system of scope certificates, transaction certificates that follow the verified raw material through from the source to the final product. So the goal of all of our standards is really to help support the verification of raw material claims, of content claims. And the global recycled standard goes even further with those additional product or processing requirements. The Responsible Down Standard was launched in 2014 through a partnership with Control Union and the North Face. This has been the second revision of the Responsible Down Standard. When we first took it on, we went through a quick revision that lasted just under a year, and then this revision was launched in 2017 and released this summer. We also own the Responsible Wool Standard, which includes animal welfare requirements, just as the RDS does, but it also has land management requirements as well. All of these standards together really offer the industry a way to track their progress towards using more preferred fiber materials. So it kind of helps set the bar of what we're trying to achieve, and also helps to monitor how far you are towards that progress, how much volume you're actually purchasing year on year. Our system of certification is definitely not just the standard. So there are three key areas of standards for textile exchange. Standard setting and writing is one of them. Assurance is another really foundational part of owning a system. So just making sure that the certification bodies are conducting audits in consistent ways, that we're really clear about what the requirements are, and that sites are meeting a similar level of conformity to our standards. Impact evaluation is another area. This is one that is relatively new for us. We're going to be looking more and more into this in the future, but really monitoring the standards that we own and ensuring that they're actually making progress towards the goals that we've identified. So these three areas are really the foundation of textile exchange standards, and they work together in a very dependent way. So standard setting creates the guidance that then drives the assurance process. It drives the audits of the facilities, and that data then can be used to help us understand the actual impact that we're having. The analysis and research into that audit data also comes from the certified units themselves. We're going to start to collect a little bit more of this aggregated data to help us understand the impact that the standards are having, and then to feed that data back into the standard setting process, so that every time we're revising a standard, we're building on the knowledge that we have learned through the previous 3 to 5 years of auditing and data. We also collect feedback from the industry. This is showing the feedback from the certified companies, but that feedback, as you'll see later when I talk about our standard setting process, comes from the full process. So we also get feedback from certification bodies, etc. Another way that this impact area helps support the process is to feed best practice into the certified companies. So we can help create best practices and guidance that then helps to support the the long-term sustainability of these facilities as well. So not just the materials that they're using, but the efficiencies and things learned at that level. So this is the overall system that Textile Exchange is operating. And so all of these, the front face of the Responsible Down Standard is definitely the criteria and the impact that we're driving at the farm level. But we have this full system behind that to help support and make sure that we really are driving towards that goal. Textile Exchange is a member of ISEAL, and that's where a lot of the principles and the concepts that you just saw in the previous slide really come from. And part of the goal of ISEAL is building up the credibility of sustainability standards as a key driver for impact across multiple industries. So these are some of the credibility principles, and having the system, that robust system of standard setting and assurance and impact evaluation helps us to meet these credibility principles. So it ensures that we're really driving towards a true sustainability mission. The standard setting principles ensure that we're impartial that we're not letting one stakeholder group kind of own the conversation, that we're transparent, that you can access records, you can see the standards, you can see the things that we're learning, how we make decisions, that we're accessible, and so on. So this really is has been, being part of ISEAL has been a huge benefit to Textile Exchange, because we've been able to learn from that community, and it's also given us kind of a path forward in terms of how to improve on our standard systems. The RDS revision process was multifaceted. We started in September 2017 with the launch of the International Working Group. The International Working Group are the key decision makers and advisors for the revision of the standards. And this is a system that we use across all of Textile Exchange standards. The first step in this process is to identify and refine the goals and objectives of the standards. We have a document that we call the Terms of Reference, and this identifies the goals, the objectives, the scope, the needs justification, any risk that we've identified, and puts it all into one document and allows us to kind of determine the North Star of the revision. What is the impact that we're trying to achieve? Where is that impact focused? And what is our strategy to move that forward? So the International Working Group in the very beginning reviewed the Terms of Reference, reviewed and gave feedback into that process. From that point on, we can set the scope of the review. We can identify the key areas for review. So that was the next step in the revision process. And then we methodically work through each of those key areas of review. So we identified multiple different areas. Some of them were specific animal welfare criteria. Some of them were certification models. Some of them were other areas of risk that we weren't really sure where it fit, but we wanted to have a discussion and try to figure out the best ways to address those areas of risk. So as we work through and research and collect feedback through all of these International Working Group meetings, all of that is feeding into the proposed draft or the list of proposed changes. And earlier this year in November, or sorry, at the end of last year, in November of 2018, we launched the public consultation. And this was a consultation on the list of proposed changes. So it was essentially what would feed into the draft RDS 3.0. So we had a period of about 2.5 months where we asked the industry to present to, to take a look at the proposed changes and give their feedback about whether they agreed or disagreed, what their opinions were. We brought all of that feedback then back to the International Working Group for their final review and decision making. We essentially kind of went through each of those different areas, got some initial feedback, went back and had some surveys to further hone in on where there were still differences of opinion, where we had consensus, and then we presented the final version for voting to the International Working Group just a few weeks ago, and then released RDS 3.0 in July of this year. The International Working Group members who were willing to be listed publicly are in front of you here. We are so thankful for the time and effort that these individuals and that these companies contributed to this process. It was definitely a lot longer of a process than we originally anticipated. There were more issues that came up than, as we kind of, dug into one thing, we would realize that actually it was a lot more complicated than we thought and needed more time for discussion and research. And so the process actually went fairly long compared to some of our other revisions or what our goals are for revisions. And so I just want to publicly recognize all of these companies for the contribution that they made to this process. We definitely would not have made it this far without them. Another thing that was kind of happening, just if I can go back just one slide, through all of this is Textile Exchange also was taking kind of a deep look in our own policies and procedures. And so some of the changes that happened towards the end were very structural, and that also kind of pushed the final date out just a little bit. But we're really pleased with the changes in the structure that we were able to get to land on. So I'll go back into a little bit more detail about that in a second. So I want to switch to talking about why RDS. Why was the Responsible Down standard developed? What impact is it having? So these are the goals that I mentioned that the International Working Group started off looking at the goals and objectives. These are the goals of Responsible Down Standard 3.0. So the first and most important, ensure that down and feathers do not come from supply chains where animals have been subjected to any unnecessary harm. This is the primary purpose of the standard, is to drive the adoption of fiber materials, of down and feathers that come from animals that have not been subjected to any unnecessary harm. So animal welfare is our primary concern with the Responsible Down standard. We also want the standard to reward and influence the down and feather industry. We believe this is a really key strategy in driving adoption of these types of supply chains, is that those that are adopting those practices are rewarded, and that we influence the down and feather industry to incentivize those practices. We also believe that education and development of the supply chain is a really important driver for continuous improvement. Part of in order for animal welfare to really take hold and to be part of an industry, you really need people to be aware and also to feel ownership over that. And education is an important tool that we can use to help do that. And so you'll see a little bit later on how some of these goals have impacted changes in the standard itself. We also want companies to have a tool to know what's in their products. When companies can make that choice, then they can also help reinforce that rewarding and influencing of the down and feather industry. So it's really important that they're able to have a tool to verify what's in their products, and also that they're providing that information to their consumers in order for those consumers to also make those types of choices. And we do that through ensuring strong chain of custody. This is a part of all of textile exchange standards, and part of the reason why they all point to the content claim standard. The scope of certification for the RDS, this has not changed. Essentially, the certification of RDS starts at the farm, at the raising farm, when the bird is 24 hours or older. So starting with the hatchling. Farms are certified to animal welfare criteria. This is that as signified by this little orange box here. Slaughterhouses, slaughter facilities are certified to or audited against animal welfare criteria as well as chain of custody. And then from that stage on, the rest of the supply chain is certified using the chain of custody criteria from the content claim standard. And this example is a specific type of supply chain, but that certification goes all the way through to the seller in the last business-to-business transaction if the brand retailer wants to label. So we require the second to the last business essentially to be certified in order for claims to be made. And all of this is still consistent with the updated version. We have some data for you. Some of this data is a little bit dated. We're still working on getting all of the data from 2018 put together. But this is just an idea of where the certified facilities for the RDS are. And these numbers include not just suppliers, but every stage of the supply chain. So farms, slaughterhouses. Farms oftentimes are certified under one scope certificate. So behind maybe one or two of the numbers that are listed here, there may be multiple farms listed under that. I think the most recent estimates we had are that there's around 1,500 or 2,000 farms that are covered by the Responsible Down standard, and around 500 million birds certified under the standard. So these numbers also include traders, processors, manufacturers, and brands and retailers. We're really proud of this growth, and we think that it's probably around the same percentage growth, maybe slightly lower from 2017 to 2018, but we didn't have any final numbers ready for communication quite yet. In terms of brand commitments, this is also another area that we're extremely proud of. This is not even close to a comprehensive list of all of the brands that have made commitments. We have spoken to and have advised somewhere over 100 brands and retailers on the RDS. These companies are joined with others on, you can find the most recent comprehensive list on Textile Exchange's Responsible Down Standard website. So you go to responsibledown.org and you'll be able to find, go to Find RDS, and you'll find that full list of brands that have requested to be publicly, that have made that public commitment to the Responsible Down Standard. Some of these brands are committed to 100% RDS. Some of them have already reached that goal. And some of them are, are using the RDS as part of a broader strategy around their down and fill products. I just saw really quickly, there's a question, does brand commitment equate to brand certification? Not always. Brands are required to be certified if they sell to retailers and if they want to label. The RDS is one of the highest drivers of product labeling for textile exchange standards that we own. So there's more people interested in labeling products to the RDS than any of our other standards. So there are more brands certified to the RDS than probably any other standard. So this is definitely an area that we're interested in growing, but not all of these brand commitments are equate to a brand certification. The standard has also gained some recognition. Initially, whenever closer to the beginning of whenever it was launched, it won a Sustainable Innovations Award granted by the outdoor industry in Europe. So the outdoor show, it was previously in Friedrichshafen. I think it was in Munich this year. And this is really in the category of sustainable innovations. And we're really, we're very, very proud of that. We were also awarded, Outdoor Industry Association recently launched the Together We Are a Force Award. And we were the Responsible Down Standard and the organizations that came together to develop it. So Textile Exchange, the North Face, Control Union, Downlight, Allied Feather and Down were all kind of jointly given this award for the development of the Responsible Down Standard. So again, very, very proud of the recognition that we've gotten at this stage. So I want to start walking you through what the first, what this new standard looks like. And I've broken up the key changes into two different areas. So we're really looking at structural changes, how the document is organized, how people will interact with the standard, and then strengthened criteria. And most of the changes fall underneath one of these categories. So in the category of structural changes, the primary thing that you'll notice is an updated set of documents. So in the past, we've had a standard and an implementation manual, and then logo use and claims guide, some other documents. From now on, all textile exchange standards will always have three key documents. They will have the standard itself, the certification procedures, and the user manual. And the Responsible Down Standard, the actual standard itself, the purpose of that document is to lay out all of the criteria that certified companies are required to meet. So anything that applies to the certified company, anything that they will be audited against, or that will help to determine whether they're eligible for certification, all of that will be found in the Responsible Down Standard document. The certification procedures is really written for the auditors and for the certification bodies. And this is a comprehensive place where everything that Textile Exchange requires the certification body to do in order to audit and grant certification is all listed in one place. And so it's really clear they're auditing against the criteria and the standard, but these are all the ways that we're expecting them to do that. So it may, show auditing sampling or how to do a risk assessment or the data that's reported to Textile Exchange, et cetera. All of this will be in the RDS certification procedures. And this document is not yet final. We're still, again, because this structure is a new one, the RDS will be the first standard to have a certification procedures document. And so we're a little bit behind from the timeline of the standard itself, but we do have a draft ready for this that we're going to be working through with the International Working Group, getting their feedback, and then releasing it publicly.
Ashley, a question just came in about the documents, and one of that is, what about the logo use and claims guide? Is that considered a key document?
Yes, it is. And we consider it a key document for labeling. It's not something that's applicable to every user of the RDS. And so for that reason, it's not included in this core set of documents, but it is absolutely still required to be followed for anyone that's making claims about the standard. And that document is also going through a revision and will be released soon. It's not going to have a ton of updates. It's going to be fairly similar to the previous version. We're just trying to make it a little bit easier to understand. So that document will be also released as well. And then finally, the RDS user manual. And essentially what this is a document that includes guidance points, includes interpretation guidance, any type of information that will help a site or a certified company understand what they need to do for compliance. It's not a guide to how to pass an audit. It's really making sure that the intentions behind the requirements, or if there's any points of clarification or interpretation, all of that will be added into the RDS user manual. And the purpose of that document, the best example that I can think of is one of the requirements in the responsible down standard is that water for drinking must be clean. Well, clean could be a subjective term, and so the user manual includes actual observation points that water that is clean meets all of these. If you look at it, it meets all of these observation points. So that's a way that provides guidance for the user to be able to know whether they're actually meeting the requirement or not. And it also provides guidance to the auditor to make sure that they are interpreting it consistently. And so the primary purpose of the user manual is to provide that interpretation to the certified companies, but we will also still be requiring certification bodies to use that in their auditing as well. And then there's, a question about translations, and I will get to translations at the end. And then will this framework be, with all of these new supporting documents, be made for all of the standards? And yes, that is our goal, but our goal is to do that as the standards are revised. And so this is all coming as the RDS is released. We're currently working on the OCS revision as well, the organic content standard, as well as the responsible wool standard. And once those standards are revised and updated, this will be the documents that are released. So I'm going to keep going. If you actually look at the document, another structural change is how the requirement levels are presented. And we have started using a traffic light system. So the responsible down standard in the previous version had these 4 categories of requirements. There was critical, I believe we called it critical major in the previous version, major, minor, and recommendations. And those are all still in this version. The one difference is that minor in the previous version, 50% of all minors within each section were required to be met for certification. So there was a chance that there were some minors that were listed that if you were not conforming, you could still be certified as long as you were meeting at least 50%. That is no longer the case. In the updated version of the Responsible Down Standard 3.0, all three of these first categories or requirement levels must be in conformance in order to be granted certification. So if you see a requirement that's listed as a minor, that requirement must be met in order to be certified. Critical essentially results in immediate suspension. So things like live plucking, force feeding, harming the animals physically, all of those are categorized as critical. And if they're observed during an audit, the certification is suspended immediately. Major requirements have 30 days to correct, and minor requirements have 60 days. The difference, how we've categorized that difference or how we've assigned those different levels, minors are ones where it's related to infrastructure or documentation. So a document is not something that's really easy to write overnight. A training plan is not something that you can just whip up overnight. Maybe you could, but it probably wouldn't be as effective. So document changes and infrastructure, things that require new buildings, new rooms added on to the buildings, those are both considered minor requirements. And then recommendations are not actually audited against, but it's a way for us to communicate things that are important and may become requirements in the future. So I've got an example here. No live plucking, that one is a critical. No molt harvesting, forced molting, or assisted molting, those all fall under the same definition of live plucking for us, also a critical. And then all down shall come from waterfowl that were raised for food. So these are all animals that are being raised into the meat supply chain, and so it's not coming from waterfowl that were in a different supply chain. So that one would be, you would have maybe 30 days to correct that action. So just whenever you're looking through the standard, you'll see the number of the requirement itself, and the traffic light system. And it's just a quicker, easier way to visually draw your attention to the most important criteria. Another thing that we've done is to reorganize the animal welfare criteria, and those are mapped to Textile Exchange's animal welfare framework. And the purpose of this is that it ties in all of these criteria to Textile Exchange's other work around animal welfare. So the end result of this is when the responsible wool standard is finalized and released, similar requirements will be placed in similar places. And so we really, for people who are using both of those standards, it will be a lot easier to know where to go to find things because both documents will be kind of laid out in a similar way. It's also a really quick way to skim through and check against maybe another type of verification at the animal welfare level. You can look through our animal welfare framework, and if it doesn't include that key principle area, then you know that it's missing something. And so the responsible down standard follows that pattern with these three areas. So all the criteria have been reorganized to fall under these specific categories. Another thing that we've done is to identify desired outcomes for all of those animal welfare criteria categories. These are at the very top of each section. The purpose of this is to make sure that everybody understands what's most important and why the criteria are there. This is the end goal, the vision of all of those criteria. And so having that desired outcome in one place makes it really easy to identify that. So strengthened criteria. This is where a lot of the kind of the meat of the update, where most of the work that the International Working Group did was contributing to these changes. So the three different categories of criteria more broadly, even though they're more specific categories based on like nutrition and living environment. But if I think about the actual changes in the criteria, there were changes that were addressing immediate risk to the animals, and there were changes that are ensuring wellness or ensuring that there's the provision of things that are good for the animals. And then there's documentation and training. And we strengthen criteria across all three of these different kind of ways to look at it. So just looking at addressing risk to the animals, in the previous version of the standard, euthanasia for sick and injured birds was listed as a minor, which meant that you could technically be certified to the standard even if you were not performing euthanasia for sick and injured birds. And this is now a major requirement. It must be met in order to be certified to the standard. There has to be a plan, a system in place for euthanasia for sick and injured birds. And the point of that is really that there's definite risk to cause suffering for the animals if they are not put out of their misery, so to speak. And so this is something that is really important for delivering on animal welfare, and it's something that we're proud to have in the updated version. Another one is stunning before slaughter. So this was another minor requirement, which meant that at the slaughterhouse, you could be certified even if you didn't have this system in place. But with the updated version, this is now a major. All slaughterhouses, all industrial size slaughterhouses are required to have stunning in place in the new version of the standard. This essentially means that the birds shouldn't feel the slaughter process. They should be stunned or unconscious for the slaughter process. And there are a couple of for both euthanasia and stunning before slaughter, there's a couple of preferred methods that are identified as well. We also have added in a more specific, more descriptive explanation of, ban on intentional mistreatment or poor handling. So both anything that results in injury to the birds is a critical. So this means then that you could, if during an audit it was observed that animals were intentionally mistreated or were not handled appropriately, that site could be immediately suspended. This is a critical level requirement. We had handling requirements in there previously, but they were worded a little bit broadly that could have led to some vague or inconsistent application. And so we've updated that. This was another one, as many of you know, live plucking is one of the key risk areas for the down and feather industry, primarily in the goose supply chain. Parent farms are outside of the scope of the responsible down standard. We only include the birds where the material is actually being collected from. But we do also acknowledge that the risk of live plucking increases anytime the amount of time a bird is kept also increases. So if you're keeping a bird for 2 years, the risk of live plucking is higher than if you're keeping a bird for 6 months. And so parent farms, the raising farms, the parent farms where birds are kept for their egg production, those animals are at a higher risk. And so rather than extending the scope of the certification and requiring all of these farms to always be audited, we have increased the control and essentially placed requirements on the raising farm that they must be purchasing from parent farms that do not practice live plucking. And they have to have a due diligence system in place to ensure that they're checking that, making sure it doesn't happen. We've also introduced risk-based visits to the parent farms by the certification bodies only to check for live plucking. So it's not extending the scope, but it is a meaningful step to address the risk of live plucking on the parent farm. And we've specifically started with the industrial goose supply chain because in those industrial supply chains is where the risk is higher. Goose supply chains, the risk is higher. In a collector-based rural supply chain, most often those are being audited under an area certification, and there's not really a distinction between parent farms and raising farms under that certification model. So moving forward, trying to keep some time for questions at the end. But another area that I mentioned in terms of strengthening the criteria that we did is looking at ways that we provide for welfare, or rather than removing risk, these are ways that we actually provide for positive animal welfare. The first is access to water for behavioral needs. So this is something that was mentioned, or that was listed as a minor in the previous version, which meant that you could be certified even if you weren't conforming to this requirement. This is now mandatory. It's required for all certified sites. Duck and geese are waterfowl, and this is something that's really important for their biological and behavioral needs. Specifically, dipping their heads is the most important thing. Swimming is also important, but dipping their heads in order to preen and to clean is really, really key. And so we are not requiring that there's water deep enough for them to swim, although we are recommending that. But we are requiring that the water that's provided for behavioral needs is at least deep enough to dip their heads. The next one is daily wellness checks. This again was a recommendation in the previous version, and it's been bumped up to a major, which means that there has to be a plan or a system in place to do daily walkthroughs of the flock to check for sick or injured birds, to check for any malfunctioning infrastructure, etc. We also had quite a bit of discussion around infrared bill trimming. This is the previous version of the standard prohibited bill trimming, any kind of treatment to the beak. And we were presented with this alternative that many companies practice infrared bill trimming or infrared bill treatment. And this is done as a way to prevent fighting between birds. There are some species of duck and geese that have a bit of a hook on the front end of their beak. And if there's fighting, that hook can cause substantial damage and injury, potentially even death, to other birds. There are definitely other ways to address that type of fighting. There's also ways that you can identify species that are less likely to fight. But this was a really, really well-debated topic within the international working group. But the ultimate final decision was to maintain this ban. And so birds that have been trimmed or that have gone through this infrared bill trimming or treatment will not comply with the standard or not conform. And then finally, in the area of documentation and training, we have split out documented management plans that are required for each area of animal welfare. So the nutrition, animal management, living environment, all those areas will have dedicated management plans that are required to be documented for each certified site. We have templates for this in the Veterinary Health and Welfare Plan, which is another document that's kind of supplemental to the user manual, where all these records and templates, record keeping templates and management plan templates can be found. And so even if a farm doesn't have any kind of documentation, if they just fill out the VHP, they ultimately will satisfy that requirement. So it's just a way for them to kind of think through and plan for that requirement. We also are requiring training for each area for all relevant workers. And so that's another area that's been individually identified and put into the standard this time. And all of these are minor requirements. They have to be met for certification, and they're given a 60-day corrective action time, just due to that additional time that might be needed to draft the documents and make sure that they're done in a way that the entire system can support it. So that is a lot of technical updates. What does this actually mean for you? What do you need to do? Well, we've got some changes that will be relevant for different groups. So I've split these up into the different sectors. Changes for certification bodies. What do you need to be doing right now? Download the relevant documents, obviously. Make sure you've got copies of the updated versions of all of these. We will be getting these out as soon as possible. We can also provide, I know we've had some requests for Word documents, and that is definitely also coming so that you can get this into your training materials and into your audit checklists more easily. Start scheduling training. We want to help support this, and so be watching for communication from Lee Tyler and Val Colden, our assurance team, and they'll start identifying ways to help support this training for auditors. Make sure you're starting to set up the necessary auditing materials, that you're identifying what's changed, what's new, what needs to go in your checklists or other materials. Let us know now if you have any questions. What can happen is that July 1st, the next point here, the deadline for compliance or conformity with RDS 3.0 is July 1st, 2020. And essentially what that date means is that any audits or certificates granted after July 1st, 2020 must be to RDS 3.0. So that's the absolute deadline for certification bodies. It would be great to have that all done and ready ahead of time, but that's the absolute deadline. What we don't want to happen is that you start to work on the updates needed on June 15th. Because if you do encounter questions, you do encounter places where the certification procedures maybe don't make sense or they need more interpretation, it's going to put a lot of pressure on you to get that question answered and get it rolled out in time for the deadline. So start working on this now. We have the materials available, more materials are coming. Start setting up the plan for how you're going to meet this deadline. Certified farms and slaughter sites have the most to manage in this upcoming year. Almost all of the key changes are other than affecting the certification bodies, they will primarily affect the farms and slaughterhouses. Those increased criteria will in some areas be fine, and in some areas will be really challenging to meet. And so download a copy of the standard, download a copy of the user manual once it's available, identify what needs to happen, and get your training plans ready. That's the most important and the easiest way to ensure that you conform in time for the deadline is if you prioritize based on what you actually need to do and the training plan, because that's going to actually put those changes into action. And then make sure that any certification renewals after July 1st, 2020, that you know when that date is for you and that you're ensuring that you have conformity in place by then. Certified companies, download a copy definitely of the updated version and of the user manual. There are not a ton of changes for supply chain entities. There are really no substantial changes for companies that are only certified to the content claims standard requirements, but it's still a good idea to read through the updated version and identify anything that you might need to be doing differently. It's also really helpful for you to start sending that message to your suppliers to make sure that if you're purchasing from a farm or a slaughter facility or whoever you're purchasing from, that message of this change and these updates are getting back to that source, that part of the supply chain. Depending on your role, you may even want to help support with the training of those facilities, especially if you've acted in that role in the past. If you've helped support training for farms and slaughter facilities, this update is fairly significant for those portions of the supply chain, and so your training will just even further help ensure success. Just a note about certified stock, we are not going to be, as happens with all standards for textile exchange when there's an update, all previous stock that's been certified to 2.0 will continue to be certified to 3.0. So you don't lose certification, or there's not any loss of previously certified material. So I know for down suppliers, sometimes you keep stock on hand for longer than a year. And so just be assured that you're not going to lose any of that. Changes for brands and retailers. Again, there's not a ton of key changes for brands and retailers, but because it's impacting the supply chain, you want to make sure, or sorry, the farms and slaughterhouses, you want to make sure that you're notifying all of your suppliers, that you point them to the recording of this webinar, point them to the website, to us, to make sure that everybody understands that this deadline is coming. And also, again, if you've acted in the role of training in the past, this is another great opportunity to help support with training as well. What's next for the standard? This is a big, there's a lot that Textile Exchange is still aiming to do in the next year. Just because the revision is over, our work is not done. The first priority for us is getting the certification procedures finished and out. Following that, we'll be working on, again, we have drafts of both of these. There's just a few little edits and revisions and feedback that we're waiting for. We will also be developing trainings for auditors. Certification bodies should start to have a plan in place, but we will also be providing some materials and even potentially some webinars and training specifically for auditors. We also want to provide versions of the user manual that may be more applicable for less literate sites, for non-English speaking sites, for European, Asian, American sites that have those kind of regional specific guidance. So we'll be helping to develop and support some of that, even again, potentially like a training of trainers or webinars to help guide the training for those sites. Data collection is another important point. This will most likely primarily be included in the certification procedures, what data is collected, so that we can start doing our own monitoring and evaluation. Translations. We are starting the process of translating all three of these key documents. And then training tools, specifically if we start to develop training tools, I think just due to the number of sites that are probably the priority would be to get this into Chinese in the user manual. But other languages we can kind of address on a case-by-case basis. But translations are definitely on the list for us. And then monitoring and evaluation, just getting the data that we collect back into that system so that we can analyze, research, learn, and pull that into to the next revision. So that was a ton of content, and we went all the way to the very end. It looks like though we still have a few minutes left if there are any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Ashley. This is an opportunity for anyone to type in any questions into the question box. We'll start with the first one, and that came from Nick, and it is, does the Pequeno cup drinker comply with this requirement?
That is a fantastic question that I do not know the answer to. I will do research and look into this, and we may even add it into the user manual, maybe identify a couple of common ways of providing water and just note whether they comply with the drinking requirements and the access to water for behavioral needs. So thank you very much for that question.
Great. The next question is, does from 6 weeks of age mean from the age of 43 and older?
Right, so yeah, 43 days, I'm assuming, and yes, that's right. I think technically the math would be 42, but yes, that's correct.
Okay, great. The next question is, if free outside access cannot be met, is it possible to certify farms with ducks, flocks between 38 and 45 days and only apply for TCs when the feathers of a specific flock / batches are below 6 weeks?
So essentially, I'll have to think through some of doing that math in my head, but essentially if there are cases where birds are not kept for 6 weeks, where they're sent to slaughter earlier than that. And in those cases, this, although our recommendation would be that birds are raised longer, ultimately when it comes down to certification, they can still be certified if they're under that 6 week or the 42-day period. In terms of what your strategy is for how you apply certification, It really comes down to looking at an individual farm, identifying whether the normal practice can meet the requirements. And if you can't, so if you have birds that you're keeping longer than 42 days and you cannot provide outdoor access, then those farms should not be certified. They would not meet certification. The aim here really is that you look at ways that outside access can be provided. And if the reason that you cannot provide outside access has something to do with, governmental oversight, which, we are aware of some of those issues, please feel free to notify us and we can help, obviously notify your certification body first, and they'll bring it to us, and we can help kind of navigate that situation and identify what's best. But ultimately, the goal should be that for all of your farms, you're finding ways to provide outside access.
Great, thank you, Ashley. The next question is, what is the qualification for a farm to be an auditor?
Yeah, so in order to qualify as an auditor for the farm level, you have to meet everything that's in Textile Exchange's accreditation and certification procedures. So that's a completely separate set of documents in addition to these three. So essentially, certification procedures applies to certification bodies and auditors that have already met all of the Textile Exchange accreditation and certification procedures. So that's the place to go to find those qualifications. In a nutshell, we require third-party accreditation and training specifically for the auditors, but there's a lot of requirements, and so it's good to check with that document directly. You can also send an email to assurance@textileexchange.org, and they can start that process with you if you're ready.
Great. We have a request to go back to the brands and retailers page, and if you can talk about the key changes briefly.
Sure. So there's not really huge changes for the brands and retailers. Most of the changes don't affect the certification of the brand. They also don't affect the labeling. There may be some updates to the logo use and claims guide once that comes out that might affect your communication strategy. But for the most part, there's not huge implications. The biggest part is just to communicate with your supply chain and make sure that they understand everything that's going to be required.
Fantastic. All right, we have the next question is, why are you choosing to release the 3.0 revision before the translations, user manual, and certification procedures are ready?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think there's a lot of benefit to getting the standard out and getting the message of what the changes are out and making sure that people start to become aware of that, even prior to some of the tools for that transition being available. We're putting really high priority on getting these documents ready and released, but this overall message of what's changed is really what's most important. That deadline is really important. And so we thought it was best to go ahead and communicate as much information as we had, and then support the entities involved in that transition.
Fantastic. And we just have about 1 minute left, and I know we won't be able to get through all the questions, so just a reminder for anyone who submitted a question and did not receive their answer, Ashley will get back to you via email afterwards. The last one we will get to is in the logo guide. It says that the RDS logo cannot be used with 100% sustainable. So does it mean that RDS is not a sustainability focused standard, or is it not possible because of the 100% part?
Right, so 100% sustainable is in quotation marks. So my assumption here is that you're talking about using the RDS and then putting a claim below it that says this product or this down is 100% sustainable. Essentially, Textile Exchange's view on that, sustainability is a very, very broad topic, and it addresses so many different things. It addresses social responsibility, chemical processing, environmental emissions. There's so much that falls under that umbrella. The RDS focus is animal welfare at the farm level. And so we want any claim that's associated with the RDS to be as specific as possible. so that consumers don't start to think that because it's RDS certified, there are no problems and I don't have to worry about anything else. That would not be accurate. So it has to do both with the percentage and also with the use of the term sustainable. We want any claims associated with the RDS to be specific to animal welfare of the material. So yeah, and they're fantastic questions. I really, really appreciate everybody paying attention and being part of this webinar, and I will get back to all of you individually. I think it might be good also for some of these questions to be included in the follow-up, just so everybody has access to that. So thank you.
Fantastic, great. Well, thank you so much, Ashley, for a wonderful presentation. Thank you for everyone for joining today, and we will be sending this out via email, the recording and presentation shortly, so please be on the lookout for that. Wishing everyone a great rest of your day and evening, wherever you are all over the world. Thanks again.
Thanks, Rita.